At the end of the 15th century, the age of great geographical discoveries began in Europe, giving rise to several colonial empires: the Spanish, French, Portuguese, and British. A little later, the young Russian state began its own expansion, though not by sea but by land, as Cossacks and servicemen moved eastward to conquer Siberia. In less than 200 years, Russia annexed vast territories from the Urals to the shores of the Pacific Ocean. Naturally, those who are proudly called pioneers in Russian historiography did not come to an empty land. Since time immemorial, Siberia has been inhabited by dozens of different tribes and peoples with their own way of life and traditions. Russian, formerly Soviet historiography persistently refers to the conquest of Siberia as its annexation. They say it was those vile Western colonizers who massacred and committed genocide against the indigenous populations of their colonies, but with Siberia it was different. The peoples living there supposedly came under Russian rule peacefully and of their own free will, where prosperity and well-being awaited them. All of this, of course, is nonsense. The indigenous people of Siberia saw the Russians as conquerors and put up fierce resistance to them, which in some places continued for a long time. In this episode, we will talk about the indigenous peoples of Siberia and the far north, their lives, way of life, and customs. You will also learn about the struggle of the Siberian peoples against the Russian invaders and their further fate after the conquest of Siberia by Moscow. My name is Semyon, and I declare the section How Did They Live? Open. Let's begin. Siberia from ancient times to the Russian conquest. The settlement of Siberia began as early as the early Paleolithic period, after the end of the Ice Age. The vast Siberian expanses were settled by people from Central Asia, who belonged to the Mongoloid race. They all lived in a clan tribal system. At the end of the first millennium before Christ, southern Siberia became part of the vast and powerful Xiongnu state, which played an important role in the history of many peoples of Eurasia. After its collapse, a significant part of the Xiongnu migrated westward and became known in Europe as the Huns. In the early Middle Ages, a powerful state called the Turkic Khaganate emerged in the east of Eurasia, and at the height of its power, it controlled vast territories from China to the eastern borders of Byzantium. It included the lands of southern Siberia, Transbaikalia, the Altai region, and the Yenisei region. Thanks to this, the Turkic language and writing spread throughout the region, and the formation of Turkic-speaking peoples such as the Altai, Tuvan, Kyrgyz, and Shor began. The Turkic Khaganate was destroyed in 745 by the warlike Uyghur tribes. At the beginning of the 13th century, the peoples of southern Siberia came under the rule of the Mongol Empire. It can be said that the Siberian lands became its first conquest. However, it should be noted that the Siberians did not offer serious resistance to the Mongols, and some peoples immediately recognized the authority of the conquerors. Only the Yenisei Kyrgyz, the Turkic people, gave a worthy response to the Mongols. After the collapse of the Golden Horde, the Siberian Khanate emerged on its western Siberian territories. The majority of its population were Tatars, while the conquered peoples, Khanty, Mansi, Nenets, and others, paid tribute to the Khan in the form of furs. It can also be added that the Siberian Khanate was an extremely unstable political entity where rebellions and internecine wars broke out regularly. By the time the Russians arrived, almost all the Koreans, a people of Siberia, lived in a communal tribal system. Statehood, although very fragile, existed only among the Tatars. The Mansi, with their 4 principalities, and the Khanty, who had formed 6 tribal unions on the lower Ob, were in the process of transitioning to feudalism. How did the indigenous peoples of Siberia live? Before the start of Russian expansion, only about 200,000 people lived in the vast territory of Siberia. The main feature of the region was the significant ethnic diversity of its population. Tribes ranged from 2,000 to 40,000 people, and settlements were mainly located along riverbanks. The level of development of each people depended primarily on the natural and climatic conditions of their habitat. The inhabitants of the tundra roamed along the shore with their herds of reindeer, setting up temporary camps. The peoples who lived in the steppe zone drove their livestock across vast pastures in the summer, and by winter returned to settlements with sturdy dwellings. The inhabitants of the taiga regions mostly led a settled way of life. They were hunters and fishermen. Polygamy was widespread among the peoples of Siberia. This became one of the main reasons why they were so reluctant to convert to orthodoxy. They also had an institution of slavery. Usually prisoners of war became slaves. In general, military conflicts between different tribes and peoples were a common occurrence. In the far north, in the coastal area of the Yamal Peninsula, lived the Nenets, whom the Russians called Samoyeds. They were engaged in hunting, fishing, and the harvesting of large marine animals such as walruses and seals. The Khanty and Mansi lived in the forests of the Ob region, and they were engaged in hunting and fishing. These tribes encountered the Russians even before Yermak's campaign. Somewhere in the 15th century south of the Ob region lived the Selkups and the Kets. In Kiev and St. Petersburg, the Siberian Tatars lived in the territories of what are now Tyumen, Omsk, Novosibirsk, and Kemerovo regions. Compared to other peoples of Siberia, they had a fairly high level of social and economic development. In their economic activities, hunting and fishing predominated. They ate fish raw, dried, and boiled. They made clothes and shoes from sturgeon skin, crossed rivers in dugout boats, hunted with bows and arrows with bone and iron tips, and made jewelry from silver, copper, and iron. In winter, the Tatars lived in semi-dugouts with stove heating, and in summer, in huts made of jardin. From the Annecy to the Code Sea, and from the northern tundra to the Amur, the Tunguses, ancestors of the modern Evenks, lived there. They built cone-shaped dwellings, which they covered on top with larch bark. The Tunguses led a nomadic lifestyle and despised hoarding. Travelers noted such qualities of the Tunguses as observance, honesty, endurance, courage, and strength. The Tunguses did not have wars of conquest, but military clashes often occurred due to blood feuds. Warriors were forbidden to kill women, children, and the elderly. Moreover, the victors took care of the women and children of their slain rivals, and when leaving, they left marks on trees so that avengers could find them. The Tunguses practiced paired exchange marriages, and the Tuvans lived in the regions of the Upper Yenisei and the Baikal area even before the Mongol invasion. They were at a high level of development, smelted iron, sowed wheat, peas, and millet. Craftsmen knew how to make silk fabrics, and were engaged in pottery and blacksmithing. In the 13th and 14th centuries, Buddhism spread into Tuva and gradually became the main religion. There were Buddhist temples, chapels, and pagodas in the cities where Buddhist monks lived. The Buryats lived in Transbaikalia, and by the time the Russians arrived, the Buryats were the most numerous and economically and militarily powerful people in eastern Siberia. In 1625, Cossack atamans Firsov and Tumanets reported that the Buryats had more than 20,000 cavalry warriors alone. The basis of the Buryats' economy was livestock breeding. In the Baikal region it was sedentary, while in Transbaikalia it was nomadic. They raised large and small livestock, horses and camels. The Buryats lived in felt yurts, hunted sable, beaver, squirrel and fox. Blacksmithing was considered an honorable and divine gift among the Buryats. The Buryats actively traded with the Evenks, Tuvans and the peoples of Central Asia and Mongolia. They did not have their own written language. Russians describe the Buryats as not particularly strong, but very brave, distinguished by their passion, hardiness, and great energy. They love truth, value friendship and love for their neighbors, and are polite in their behavior. The Turkic-speaking Yakuts lived on the Olini and Vilyuy rivers. According to legend, they fled there from the area around Lake Baikal, which is confirmed by modern research. In the north, the Yakuts adapted to raising cattle and horses, preserved their language and culture, and knew how to smelt iron from ore. Moreover, the blacksmith was considered a highly respected profession, almost on the same level as a shaman. In Yakut traditions, there was patriarchy, polygamy, bride price, and rivalry between warriors and heroes. They had a rich oral folk tradition, including fairy tales, epic poems about heroes, legends, songs, proverbs, and riddles. The Yukagirs lived along the Yana and Indigirka rivers. They were considered the best dog breeders in Siberia. At the time of the arrival of the Russians, the Yukagirs still retained remnants of matriarchy. After the wedding, the husband would move into his wife's home and work within her family. Women enjoyed great independence and young girls had freedom. The Chukchi lived in the lower reaches of the Kolyma River and in Chukotka, and mainly survived by hunting marine mammals such as walruses, seals, and even whales. They were known for their warlike and fierce nature. Russians noted that the Chukchi surpassed all their wild neighbors in bravery, but also differed greatly in the cruelty of their customs from them. It was written that the Chukchi not only killed their children born with disabilities, but also mercilessly killed the elderly who, due to frailty, were no longer useful to the family. Generally speaking, the indigenous peoples of Siberia have learned to live in places where there are almost no conditions for life. In their stubborn and endless struggle with nature, they perfected their household items, clothing, weapons, and equipment, and learned to use the resources around them almost 100%. Even an ordinary chum, which looks very simple and primitive at first glance, is actually a true masterpiece of engineering, perfectly suited for the harsh conditions of the north. Siberians lived in harmony with the harsh surrounding nature. They were unmatched hunters, knew the habits of animals, could track them in the taiga, were excellent marksmen, and made ingenious hunting traps. But at the same time, they never killed animals for fun and never exterminated them completely. Overall, the indigenous people of Siberia amazed Russian colonizers with their simplicity and honesty. Tatishchev wrote about the native Siberians, saying that by nature they are just and humble. There is very little perjury, theft, deceit, and things like that among them. And if such things do happen, it is only among those who have lived with Russians for a long time and have learned shamanism and the ways of shamans from them. The overwhelming majority of the indigenous people of Siberia were pagans. They practiced shamanism. This is one of the oldest religious systems, the essence of which is the animating of the surrounding nature. In other words, Siberians believed that our world is filled with spirits, both good and evil. You had to ask good spirits for help and know how to protect yourself from evil ones. The main intermediary between the world of people and the spirits was the shaman, who could communicate with the spirits by entering a trance state. The functions of shamans were extremely broad. They healed, delivered babies, predicted the future, and influenced the weather. For performing rituals, shamans had sacred attributes such as drums, masks, and staffs. Shamanism has survived in Siberia to this day, although the Soviet authorities fiercely fought against it. Most shamans were executed or perished in concentration camps. The most developed traditions of shamanism are among the Buryats. They even had special schools that trained shamans. By the way, Russian settlers never doubted the power of shamans. The peoples of Siberia also had their own deities, and their pantheons were quite extensive. Their hierarchy remained fluid, and worship did not settle into fixed forms of rituals. The earthly body of a deity was considered to be an idol, which was placed in sanctuaries or carried along during travels. People worshipped these idols and made offerings to them. However, if a deity did not fulfill requests, it could be chopped up and burned. The indigenous peoples of Siberia also believed in sacred animals such as the bear, elk, deer, and raven. The annexation of Siberia. It is traditionally believed that the process of colonizing Siberia began with Yermak's campaign against the Siberian Khanate in 1581. However, Russian merchants had been traveling beyond the Urals long before Yermak, primarily drawn by furs or soft goods, which were valued at incredibly high prices. However, Yermak's campaign is notable because it was a real war that the Russians fought against a state entity in Siberia. After that, a true conquest began, very similar to the Spanish conquests in Central and South America. Interestingly, Yermak's campaign was originally a private enterprise, funded by the Stroganov merchants. At first, the Russian central authorities distanced themselves from this venture in every possible way, but when it succeeded, Moscow quickly took control of the new lands. It's important to understand why exactly the Russians went east. The Russian state didn't really need the Siberian lands, since only a small part of them was suitable for agriculture. The Moscow Tsar was only interested in the resources that could be extracted from the new territories. First and foremost, it was the same old furs, but there were also valuable types of fish, walrus tusks, seals, fat, and silver. Later, this approach was very accurately expressed by Mikhail Lomonosov: Russia will grow through Siberia. In other words, the metropolis takes resources from the colony, giving almost nothing in return. As for the ordinary Russian conquistadors, it was not romance or the desire to discover new lands that drove them east, but simply the thirst for profit. In this regard, they were not much different from their Spanish or British counterparts. Such motivation led to rampant looting of the local population, which naturally provoked a response. After the defeat of the Siberian Khanate, the Russians fought for a long time against the Yenisei Kyrgyz, subdued the Yenets and Yakuts, and launched campaigns against the Buryats. Almost the entire 17th century was marked by uprisings in Siberia, caused by extortion and lawlessness on the part of the military of that time, so to speak. However, the most striking and little-known chapter of the conquest of Siberia is, of course, the Russian Chukchi War, which was accompanied by terrible genocide and equally fierce revenge for that genocide. The year 1727 is considered the beginning of this war. But in fact, it was a continuation of a series of conflicts between the Russians and the Chukchi that had been going on since the mid-17th century. At the end of Peter Tver's reign, 2 strong detachments of Cossacks were sent to Chukotka to force its inhabitants to pay tribute. Yasak. The Russian troops used scorched earth tactics, exterminating members of the rebellious tribe, but this only made the Chukchi more determined. In the end, the punitive detachments were defeated, but the fighting continued for another 50 years. In the end, the Russian government decided that it would be much cheaper to exempt the Chukchi from taxes than to finance a war on the other side of the world. Thus, the Chukchi defended their independence and for the next 100 years had the official status of a not fully conquered people. But when it comes to the Russian colonization of Siberia, the result of such annexation was the disappearance of many peoples, a process that is still happening today. For example, today the Khanty make up 1.2% of the population of the Khanty-Mansi Autonomous Okrug and the Mansi even less, just 0.7%. And that's despite the fact that up to 60% of Russian oil is extracted from their ancestral land. The descendants of proud warriors and hunters are moving to cities, forgetting their language and customs. A few words in conclusion. The annexation of Siberian lands became a turning point in Russian history. It was precisely thanks to the resources of these new territories that Russia became a true empire and for several centuries turned into a serious geopolitical player. However, this did not bring happiness and prosperity to the indigenous peoples of Siberia, which remained a colony from which the metropolis simply extracts resources. It remains this way even today, which affects not only the indigenous Siberians but also Russians of the titular nation, the descendants of those very legendary pioneers whom official sources love to talk about so much. Well, that's all from me. See you in the next episode. Bye.